The mud was still fresh on her knees from the day her alpha threw her out. Too soft, he had declared in front of the entire pack. Useless to the bloodline. But a year later, when he kicked down her cabin door to remind her she was nothing, he didn't expect the shadows to move. He didn't expect the High King of the Northern Wastes, the most ruthless wolf alive, standing on her porch, waiting for her to invite him in. The great hall of the crag smelled of roasted meat, wet dog, and impending violence. Rowan stood in the center of the rush-covered floor. Her left arm was bound tightly in linen, the fabric already turning a dull, rusty brown. Blood dripped from her fingertips, hitting the stone with a rhythmic tap, tap, tap. Nobody offered her a chair. Nobody offered her a drink. The 40 wolves of her pack lined the edges of the room, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim torchlight. They were waiting for the execution of a social death. Kaelin sat in the high seat carved from black oak. He was a massive man, built for swinging battle axes and breaking spines. He had been her mate for 3 years. Right now he looked at her like she was something he had scraped off his boot. A pregnant rogue, Kaelin said. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated against the stones. You let a pregnant rogue cross our borders, steal our winter stores, and walk out alive. She was starving, Rowan said. Her voice was cracked. Her throat felt like it was lined with ash. And she was close to whelping. I took the meat back. There was no need to take her throat. This is the frontier, Rowan, not a nursery. Kaelin stood up. The heavy fur cloak draped over his broad shoulders shifted. Mercy is a rot. It spreads. First you spare a thief, then you hesitate in a raid. You are my mate. You are supposed to be the Luna of this pack. You are supposed to be iron. I am a tracker. She replied evenly, though her heart hammered against her ribs. I found her. I secured the perimeter. I did my job. Kaelin descended the 3 stone steps from the dais. He walked slowly, the heavy thud of his leather boots echoing in the silent hall. He stopped inches from her. He smelled of pine-cold steel and another woman's perfume, a sharp floral scent that Rowan recognized as Maeve's. That realization was a dull ache, secondary to the cold dread pooling in her stomach. You are weak, Kaelin said. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The quietness of it made it absolute. You don't have the stomach for what is coming. The border wars are escalating. I need a mate who can rip a throat out without blinking, not one who plays midwife to our enemies. Rowan stared into his eyes. There was no warmth there. The mating bond, that invisible tether that had hummed between them for 3 years, felt thin. Brittle. You're discarding me, she stated. No question, just a fact. I, Kaelin of the Crag, sever this bond, he said the ancient words heavy and sharp. I cast you from this territory. You are no longer of my blood, no longer of my hearth. You are rogue. The snap was physical. Rowan gasped, her knees buckling. It felt like a rusted hook had been violently yanked from her chest, taking a piece of her lung with it. She hit the stone floor hard, jarring her wounded arm. The pain was blinding, a white-hot flare that drowned out the room. She bit her tongue to keep from screaming. She would not give him that. The metallic taste of her own blood filled her mouth. She stayed on her hands and knees for a long moment, breathing in the dirt and the damp rushes. The pack watched in silence. Some looked away. Most just stared, their faces blank masks. Pack loyalty was a myth taught to pups. Survival was the only real law. Slowly Rowan forced herself up. Her legs trembled, but she locked her knees. She didn't look at Kaelin. She didn't look at Maeve, who had stepped closer to the dais. Take what you can carry, Kaelin said, turning his back to her. Be gone by dawn. Rowan walked out of the hall. The rain hit her face the moment she pushed through the heavy wooden doors. It was a freezing, sleeting downpour. She went to her quarters, packed a waxed canvas rucksack with a flint, an iron pot, her hunting knives, and a heavy wool blanket. She didn't take any of the finery Kaelin had bought her. She left the silver combs and the dyed silks on the bed. She walked out of the keep's gates an hour later. The guards didn't speak to her. The iron portcullis slammed shut behind her with a final echoing clang. She was alone in the dark, and for the first time in her life, the silence in her head belonged only to her. 3 months later, survival had stripped away the last of Rowan's illusions. She lived in a dilapidated woodcutter's cabin in the Scabelands, a stretch of disputed rocky territory that no pack wanted because it yielded nothing but scrub brush and bitter winds. The roof leaked, the chimney drafted. The cold was a living thing that chewed at her bones. But she was alive. She had learned that loneliness was vastly preferable to the constant suffocating pressure of trying to prove her worth to people who fundamentally despised her. She set snares for rabbits. She foraged for bitter roots before the frost locked the earth tight. She traded pelts with wandering human merchants for salt and oats. She grew lean. Her hands grew calloused and permanently stained with dirt and dried blood from skinning catches. The weakness Kaelan had despised was gone, replaced by a quiet, ruthless efficiency. It was the dead of January when she found him. Rowan was checking a snare line 2 miles from her cabin. The snow was thigh-deep, a blinding expanse of white under a pale winter sun. She saw the blood trail first. It wasn't the scattered drops of a wounded deer. It was a thick, dark smear painting the snow crimson. She unholstered her crossbow, loading a bolt with numb fingers, and followed the trail. At the base of a massive dead oak tree lay a wolf. Rowan stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She had never seen a wolf this size. It was pitch black, a vast expanse of muscle and thick fur easily the size of a warhorse. It lay on its side, its massive ribcage rising and falling in shallow, erratic jerks. Protruding from its thick shoulder was a heavy iron quarrel, a crossbow bolt. And from the blackened, festering edges of the wound, Rowan knew immediately what it was. Silver-tipped. Poison to their kind. The wolf's head snapped toward her as she crunched through the snow. Its eyes were a startling, piercing gold. Even dying, the beast exuded an aura of crushing dominance. Rowan felt an instinctual urge to bare her throat, to press her face into the snow. She forced the instinct down. She was a rogue now. She bowed to no one. "You're a mess," she murmured, keeping her crossbow lowered but ready. The wolf growled. The sound rattled her teeth. It tried to stand, but its front leg collapsed, sending it face first into the bloody snow. It whined a low, pathetic sound that was instantly cut off, as if the beast was embarrassed by its own weakness. Rowan stood there. Practicality dictated she leave it. A wolf that size belonged to a powerful pack, likely a royal guard or an alpha from the inner territories. Healing him meant drawing attention. Letting him die meant a massive, valuable pelt and meat for a month. "Mercy is a rot," Kaelan's voice echoed in her memory. Rowan slung her crossbow over her shoulder. "Idiots, the lot of you," she muttered. She approached the wolf. It bared fangs the size of daggers snapping at her leg. She sidestepped, grabbed its good ear, and roughly shoved its massive head into the snow. "Stop it! I'm going to pull the bolt. If you bite me, I'll slit your throat and make a rug out of you." The gold eyes locked onto hers. The feral panic faded, replaced by a sharp, calculating intelligence. It went still. Rowan clamped her boots on either side of the wolf's leg. She grabbed the bloody shaft of the bolt with both hands. "On 3. 1, 2. She yanked on 2. The wolf let out a roaring snarl, thrashing violently. Black blood, tainted with silver, spewed from the wound, steaming in the freezing air. Rowan fell backward into the snow, the heavy iron bolt clutched in her hands. "Got it," she gasped. Getting the beast back to her cabin took 4 hours. She had to build a makeshift sled from pine branches and drag him. By the time they reached her door, the sun was down, and Rowan's muscles were screaming. For the next 3 weeks the cabin smelled of pine sap, boiling water, and wet fur. The wolf did not shift. He remained in his beast form, taking up half the floor space by the hearth. He watched her. Constantly. Those gold eyes tracked her as she chopped wood, as she boiled rabbit stew, as she cleaned her weapons. She talked to him because the silence was driving her mad. "You know," she said one evening, applying a poultice of chewed yarrow to his healing shoulder, "my alpha threw me out because I saved a stray. Here I am doing it again. Apparently I lack the capacity to learn." The wolf huffed a warm burst of air, hitting her face. He nudged her knee with his massive wet nose. "Don't get used to it," she warned, pulling back. "Once you can walk without falling over, you're out. I don't have enough food for a giant." By the 4th week, the snow began to melt. The mud season arrived, turning the Scablands into a brown, sludgy hell. Rowan woke up one morning, the fire dead in the hearth. The corner of the room was empty. The wolf was gone. The door was slightly ajar, swinging lazily on its leather hinges. There were massive paw prints in the mud outside, heading south toward the King's Road, disappearing into the tree line. Rowan stood in the doorway, the damp spring wind chilling her through her tunic. She felt a bizarre, sharp pang in her chest. She ignored it, grabbing her axe to chop the morning firewood. She was alone again. It was better this way. Spring brought Thor, and Thor brought Kaelin. Rowan was in her small garden, aggressively yanking weeds from the damp earth, when she heard the horses. She stood up, wiping mud from her forehead with the back of a filthy glove. 4 riders crested the ridge. Even from a distance she recognized the heavy black cloaks and the iron stag sigil of the Crag pack. At their head was Kaelin. Rowan didn't run. She didn't reach for her weapons inside the cabin. She simply stood by her meagre plot of turnips, her spine straight, waiting. Kaelin reined his massive destrier to a halt a few yards away. The horse snorted, stamping its heavy hooves in the mud. Kaelin looked down at her. He looked the same broad, arrogant, and neatly trimmed beard framing his hard jaw, but his eyes swept over her with a mixture of pity and disgust. "You look like a peasant, Rowan," Kaelin said by way of greeting. "And you look like a man trespassing on rogue land." She replied, her voice deadpan. One of the men behind Kaelin, a young brute named Cedric, snickered. Kaelin raised a hand, silencing him. "This isn't rogue land anymore," Kaelin said, shifting his weight in the saddle. "The crag is expanding. The border skirmishes are over. We won. I'm building a watchtower on this ridge. It commands the valley." Rowan looked around at her pathetic cabin, her tiny garden. "There are a dozen ridges. Pick another." Kaelin sighed, the heavy sound of a man burdened by the stupidity of others. He dismounted his boots, sinking an inch into the mud. He walked toward her, towering over her. The sheer physical presence of an alpha was designed to make weaker wolves cower. Rowan felt the heavy pressure in the air, the instinct to submit, pulling at her spine. She locked her knees. "I'm not asking, Rowan," he said quietly. "I'm telling you. You have until sundown to pack your things. If you are still here tomorrow, my men will burn the cabin with you in it." "You cast me out," Rowan said, her voice dropping to a dangerous hush. "You took my home, my pack, my safety. You will not take this dirt from me." Kaelin laughed. It was a short, humorless bark. "Or what, you'll fight me? You were too weak to kill a starving pregnant female. You think you can stand against me?" He reached out, grabbing her jaw with a large, rough hand. His grip was a vice. "You are nothing. You have always been nothing." Rowan didn't flinch. She stared into his eyes, calculating exactly how fast she could draw the boot knife she kept strapped to her ankle, and whether she could bury it in his neck before his men tore her apart. Before she could move, the air shifted. It wasn't a breeze, it was a sudden violent drop in atmospheric pressure. The damp smell of mud and rotting leaves vanished, replaced by the sharp, terrifying scent of ozone and crushing winter ice. Kaelin's horse panicked. The massive beast reared up, screaming in terror, throwing its heavy head. Cedric and the other riders struggled to control their mounts, their faces suddenly pale. Kaelin let go of Rowan's jaw, stepping back, his hand dropping to the hilt of his broadsword. The sound of hoofbeats approached from the south. Not 4 riders, dozens. The rhythmic, thunderous drumming shook the mud beneath their feet. Over the ridge came a vanguard of heavy cavalry. They wore armor of blackened steel. At the head of the column flew a massive banner, a silver wolf's head on a field of pitch black. The crown, the High King's personal guard. Kaelin's arrogance vanished, replaced by stark panic. The High King Gideon of the Northern Wastes did not travel to the borders unless he was bringing war. He was a tyrant, a conqueror who had united the northern packs through sheer, unadulterated brutality. The cavalry circled the small clearing, completely boxing in Kaelin and his men. The Krag wolves looked like children playing dress-up, surrounded by these scarred, silent veterans. A single rider moved to the front. He rode a monstrous black destrier. The man was massive, his shoulders impossibly broad beneath a heavy, fur-lined cloak. He wore no helmet. His hair was dark, cropped close to his scalp, and a vicious, jagged scar ran down the left side of his face. Kaelin instantly dropped to one knee in the mud, bowing his head. His men scrambled from their horses to do the same. "My king!" Kaelin shouted over the stamping of hooves. "We did not expect you. The crag welcomes you. Whatever tribute you require, the king didn't even look at him." Gideon dismounted. His movements were terrifyingly fluid for a man of his size. He walked past Kaelin's kneeling form, as if the Alpha were nothing more than a rock in the road. He stopped 2 feet from Rowan. Rowan stood frozen. She looked up into his face. Her breath hitched. The scar was anew, but the eyes piercing, calculating, and a startling, brilliant gold she knew perfectly well. Gideon looked at the mud on her face. He looked at the red marks on her jaw where Kaelin had grabbed her. A low, terrifying rumble began in his chest, a sound that made Kaelin and his men press themselves closer to the dirt. "I told you," Rowan whispered the realization, crashing through her like a wave of ice water. "I didn't have enough food for a giant." The High King's lips twitched. The terrifying aura around him softened just for a fraction of a second. "I brought my own," Gideon replied, his voice a deep, gravelly rasp that sent a shiver down her spine. He reached out his massive, scarred hand, gently brushing a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "And I came to pay my debts." He turned slowly, facing Kaelin. The softness vanished. The monster returned. "You," Gideon said, pointing a single steel gauntleted finger at Kaelin. "Get off her land." Kaelin stayed on his knees, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth. The mud soaked through his heavy woolen breeches, staining the expensive dyed fabric. He looked from Gideon's scarred boots to Rowan, who was standing by her turnips with her arms crossed over her chest. "My king." Kaelin started, his voice strained. He was trying to find the balance between submission and his own wounded pride. "She is a rogue, cast out by my own word, a drain on the territory." Gideon didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The sheer suffocating pressure of his aura rolled off him in waves thick and cold. It smelled of ozone and snapped pine. "I did not ask for the history of your mistakes," Gideon said. He slowly turned his head to look down at the Alpha of the crag. "I told you to get off her land. The crag requires this ridge for defense." Kaelin pushed the desperation, making him stupid. Gideon moved. It was a terrifying blur of motion for a man wearing 50 pounds of blackened steel armor. 1 second he was standing casually. The next, his gauntlet was wrapped around Kaelin's throat. The king lifted the Alpha entirely off his feet. Kaelin's heavy boots kicked uselessly in the air, scattering mud. His men scrambled backward, hands instinctively dropping away from their weapons. Nobody drew steel on the High King and lived to sheath it. "Your defense is my purview." Gideon whispered, the sound scraping like 2 stones grinding together. "Your borders exist because I allow them to. This dirt belongs to the woman who pulled silver from my flesh when cowards like you would have left me to rot. If you look at her again, I will tear your pack apart and feed your bones to my hounds. Nod if you understand." Kaelin, face turning a mottled, ugly purple, jerked his chin in a frantic nod. Gideon dropped him. Kaelan hit the mud hard, gasping for air, clutching his bruised throat. "Ride," Gideon commanded. It was a chaotic, humiliating retreat. The crag wolves scrambled onto their panicked horses, not bothering to form a column. They broke over the ridge and disappeared, leaving the heavy scent of fear in their wake. Rowan watched them go. Her pulse was a frantic drumbeat in her ears, but she kept her face perfectly still. She looked at the giant of a man standing in her ruined garden, the king of the northern wastes, a myth written in blood and iron. "I had it handled," Rowan said. Gideon turned to her. The lethal edge in his posture vanished, replaced by a weary stillness. He looked at her small, calloused hands, the dirt caked under her fingernails, the threadbare wool of her tunic. "He had 4 men, and you had a boot knife." Gideon noted his golden eyes flicking to her ankle. "I'm fast. He is heavy." Gideon took a step toward her. "I owe you a life debt. I do not leave debts unpaid. You are coming with me." Rowan laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. "No, I'm not. You think because you chased off my ex, I'm going to trade one controlling alpha for an even bigger one. I survived the winter alone. I built this place. I don't need a savior, and I certainly don't need a king." Gideon didn't look angry. He looked observant. "Your roof is caving in. Your stores are empty. You are surviving, Rowan. You are not living." He gestured to the vast, empty expanse of the Scablands. "Kaelan will return. Not today. Not tomorrow. But when my riders are gone, he will come back with 50 men to burn you out because his pride cannot handle that you witnessed him on his knees." Rowan bit the inside of her cheek. He was right. Kaelan was a petty man, and petty men were dangerous when humiliated. "I am not a charity case," she said fiercely. "I run a fortress, not a charity," Gideon replied smoothly. "You tracked a starving rogue across 50 miles of hard terrain. You extracted a poisoned bolt and kept an apex predator alive through mud season using nothing but weeds and rabbit broth. I need people who do not break when the world gets heavy." He held out a massive scarred hand. "Come to the north. Earn your keep. No charity. No submission." Rowan looked at his hand. It was rough, heavily calloused, missing the tip of the pinky finger. It was the hand of a man who worked for what he had. She walked past his outstretched hand. "I need to pack my pots." The journey north took 10 days. They rode through the biting spring winds, leaving the scrublands for the towering ancient pines of the deep territory. Rowan rode a massive roan mare Gideon provided, staying near the middle of the vanguard. The soldiers ignored her, which suited her fine. They were hardened men and women, their armor battered their faces, scarred by the vicious border wars that kept the king in power. When the fortress of Ethelgard finally broke through the tree line, Rowan stopped her horse. It wasn't a castle built for vanity. It was a massive brutalist structure of dark grey stone, carved directly into the side of a sheer mountain cliff. There were no stained glass windows or decorative banners. It was entirely functional, thick walls, deep parapets, and heavy iron gates. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting meat, and forged steel. Inside the courtyard, it was a hive of controlled chaos. Blacksmiths hammered at anvils, soldiers drilled in the mud, and handlers walked massive wolfhound mixes the size of ponies. Gideon dismounted, tossing his reins to a waiting stable hand. He turned to Rowan as she slid down from her saddle. Her legs ached, but she kept her spine straight. "The steward will show you to the eastern wing," Gideon said, unbuckling his heavy riding cloak. "You will have a room, hot water, food, and a job," Rowan reminded him. Gideon paused. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of his mouth. "Are you always this stubborn? Are you always this deaf? I said I would earn my keep." "Fine," Gideon said, gesturing to a grizzled older man missing an eye who was approaching them. "This is Corin, Master of Hounds. Corin, she has a way with miserable biting beasts. Put her to work." Corin looked Rowan up and down, taking in her small frame and dirt-stained clothes. "She's a bit small to be wrestling the war dogs, sire." She wrestles just fine. Gideon said, his eyes locking onto Rowan's for a fraction of a second, before he turned and walked toward the main keep, his generals falling into step behind him. For the next 3 weeks, Rowan lived in a state of exhausting, satisfying labor. She refused the lavish chambers in the eastern wing, instead taking a small, drafty room above the kennels. The work was brutal. The warhounds were half-feral, massive beasts bred to rip riders from saddles. They required feeding, mucking, and training, but it was honest. There were no court politics in the kennels. The dogs didn't care about her bloodline or her past. If she fed them and didn't flinch when they snapped, they respected her. She saw the king only from a distance. He was a constant blur of motion, drilling with the soldiers riding out to inspect the northern passes or locked in council. He never summoned her. He never checked on her. He had given her exactly what she asked for a place to exist without debt. It was late one evening when the routine broke. Rowan was sitting on an overturned bucket in the kennels, stitching up a deep gash on the flank of a massive brindlehound named Brutus. The dog had gotten tangled in briar wire during a training run. Her hands were covered in iodine and dog blood. The heavy wooden door of the kennel creaked open. The ambient noise of 30 sleeping dogs shifted as heads lifted and tails thumped quietly against the straw. Gideon stepped inside. He was out of his armor, wearing a simple linen shirt and dark leather trousers. The exhaustion was etched deep into the lines of his face. He walked over to her, his massive frame making the large kennel feel suddenly claustrophobic. He didn't speak. He simply grabbed another bucket, flipped it over, and sat down opposite her, watching her work the needle through the dog's thick hide. "You missed dinner in the Great Hall," Gideon observed quietly. "Brutus needed stitches," Rowan said, tying off a knot with her teeth and snipping the thick thread with a small knife. He was impatient. "You could have had one of the handlers do it. They're my responsibility. I do my own work." She patted the dog's heavy head, and Brutus let out a rumbling sigh, resting his chin on her knee. Rowan finally looked up at the king. In the dim light of the oil lanterns, his scar looked livid, pulling the skin tight around his eye. "You look terrible." Gideon let out a low, breathy laugh. "Treason." "Honesty. There's a difference." Rowan wiped her bloody hands on a rag. "Why are you down here? Doesn't the king have better things to do than watch a rogue sew up a dog?" "The king needed quiet," Gideon said, leaning his elbows on his knees. He looked at the rows of sleeping hounds. "The council chamber is full of men shouting about borders and grain taxes. Sometimes I prefer the company of beasts. They are exactly what they appear to be." Rowan looked at him. Really looked at him. The tyrant of the north. The monster. He just looked like a tired man carrying too much weight. "Who shot you?" she asked. The question had been burning in her chest for months. Gideon went still. His golden eyes snapped to hers. "You are bold, little rogue." "I pulled the bolt out of your shoulder. I earned the right to ask." Silence stretched between them, heavy and thick with the scent of hay and iodine. "My brother Gideon," finally said, his voice stripped of all emotion. It was a terrifying, flat sound. "He believed my methods were too brutal to unite the packs. He believed he would be a more diplomatic king. He hired a mercenary with a silver crossbow to shoot me while I was patrolling the Scablands alone." Rowan felt a cold twist in her gut. Betrayal from a mate was one thing. Betrayal from blood was another entirely. "Where is your brother now?" Gideon looked back at her. The gold in his eyes was hard as polished coin. Diplomacy failed him. He didn't need to elaborate. Rowan understood exactly what that meant. "So," Gideon murmured, shifting the subject, "has Ethelgard proven better than a leaky cabin?" "The roof doesn't leak," Rowan conceded. "And the dogs are better company than Kaelin." Gideon smiled. It was a small, genuine thing that completely changed the hard lines of his face. "I'm glad you stayed, Rowan." He stood up, his massive frame blocking the lantern light. He reached out, his knuckles lightly grazing the crown of her head, a fleeting, almost hesitant touch, before he turned and walked out into the cold night. Rowan sat there for a long time, the ghost of his touch burning a hole straight through her hard-won defences. Summer hit the northern wastes like a hammer. The snowmelt flooded the rivers, and the heat turned the mountain passes into humid, suffocating corridors. With the heat came the rumours. Rowan heard them in the kitchens when she went to fetch heavy sacks of meat scraps for the hounds. She heard them from the blacksmiths when she brought broken choke chains to be welded. Kaelin had not quietly swallowed his pride. Humiliated in front of his own men by the High King, Kaelin had spent the spring whispering to the southern border packs. He spoke of a king who had gone mad, a king who abandoned military protocol to coddle a weak, exiled female. He painted Gideon as compromised, using Rowan's presence in Ethelgard as proof that the crown was vulnerable. They say the crag has blocked the southern trade routes. A scullery maid whispered one morning as Rowan hauled a side of beef onto a butcher's block, saying they won't open them until the king pays a toll. Rowan brought her cleaver down, hard, severing bone, with a loud crack. The maid jumped. "Gideon won't pay a toll," Rowan said tightly, her eyes fixed on the meat. "No, but he'll have to march." The butcher grunted, wiping his bloody hands on an apron. "And a march means war, all over some wounded pride down south." Rowan left the kitchens with a heavy heart. She knew Kaelin. He was a coward, but a manipulative one. He wouldn't fight Gideon directly. He would choke the supply line, starve the outer villages, and force Gideon into a protracted, exhausting siege. And it was all because she had refused to die quietly in the mud. That evening the fortress was tense. Armed patrols were doubled. The heavy clanking of plate armour echoed through the courtyard long after the sun set. Rowan didn't go to her room. She walked the parapets. The wind whipping off the mountains was freezing, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the day. She stood by the stone merlons looking out into the pitch-black valley below. You should be asleep. Rowan didn't jump. She had learned the heavy, distinct sound of Gideon's boots. He stepped out of the shadows, the wind catching his heavy black cloak. "I was thinking," Rowan said, not looking at him. Dangerous habit. He stood beside her, resting his forearms on the freezing stone. "They're going to war because of me." The words tasted like ash. "Kaelin is rallying the southern packs because his ego couldn't handle you humiliating him on my behalf. The trade routes are choking. Your people are going to suffer." "My people suffer when the winter is hard. They suffer when the crops fail." Gideon replied, his tone dismissive. "A petty blockade by a petty alpha is a Tuesday. Don't patronize me." Rowan snapped, finally turning to face him. Her frustration boiled over. "I know how this works. I was meant to be a Luna. I know pack politics. He is using me as the wedge to divide your loyalists. They think you are weak because you brought a rogue into your keep." Gideon turned, pinning her with a stare that made the air feel suddenly thin. He stepped closer. The heat radiating off him combated the freezing wind. "Do you think I am weak, Rowan?" He asked, his voice a low, vibrating hum. "No," she said, her breath hitching. "Do you think I brought you here because I pity you? I don't know why you brought me here." Gideon raised a hand, his rough thumb brushing along her jawline exactly where Kaelin had bruised her months ago. The touch was achingly gentle, completely at odds with the violent world they inhabited. "I brought you here," Gideon said, stepping so close she could feel the solid wall of his chest against her shoulders, "because my court is full of sycophants, liars, and men waiting for me to bleed. You are the only person in this fortress who looks at me and sees a man, not a crown. You did not flinch when Kaelin threatened you. You did not flinch when I bled on your floor. You are the strongest creature I have ever met." Rowan's heart hammered against her ribs, frantic and wild. "Gideon, let Kaelin choke the roads." Gideon murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip. His eyes darkened, the gold swirling with something heavy, possessive, and deeply ancient. Let him rally his cowards. I will march south. I will burn the crag to its foundations, and I will show them exactly what happens when they threaten what is mine. Rowan froze. Yours. Gideon dropped his hand, stepping back slightly, leaving her skin burning where he had touched it. The feral intensity was instantly masked by the cold, calculating king. Pack your gear. Gideon commanded, his voice returning to its normal gravelly bark. We march at dawn. You wanted to earn your keep. You are my lead tracker. You are going to guide my vanguard straight through the Scablands and into the heart of Kaelin's territory. We are going to end this. An army of wolves does not march. It prowls. 300 of the High King's vanguard moved south, a river of blackened steel and dark fur cutting through the dense pine forests. They did not light fires at night. They did not sing marching songs. They communicated in low whistles and the clatter of weapons checking against armor. The air tasted of iron and impending violence. Rowan rode at the absolute front. Gideon had placed her beside his own massive destrier, a terrifying honor that drew the stares of his generals. She ignored them. She focused on the dirt. The Scablands were a treacherous maze of sinkholes, shifting scree and dense briar thickets that could tear a horse's leg to ribbons. But Rowan knew this land intimately. She had bled on it. She had survived it. On the third day, the rain started. It was a torrential, blinding downpour that turned the ground into a muddy soup. "Halt the column!" Rowan called out, raising a fist. The command rippled back. 300 heavily armed warriors ground to a halt in perfect, eerie synchronization. Gideon steered his horse closer to hers, the rain slicking his dark hair to his skull. The jagged scar on his face looked pale in the grey light. "Why are we stopping?" asked General Miller, a grizzled veteran riding at Gideon's left. He looked at Rowan with thinly veiled skepticism. "The crag is less than 20 miles away. We can hit their outer borders by nightfall." Rowan slid off her mare. Her boots sank an inch into the muck. She walked forward, peering at the narrow gorge ahead of them. The rock walls rose sharply on either side, slick with rain. "Because Kaelin is a coward, but he isn't stupid," Rowan said, wiping water from her eyes. She knelt in the mud, pointing to a series of deep gouges near the base of the rock wall. "He knows this gorge is the fastest route for cavalry. Look at the mud. It's been overturned recently. The water pooling in these tracks is muddy, not clear. Someone was here this morning." Miller scoffed. "A scouting party. We outnumber them 10 to 1. "It's not a scouting party," Rowan replied, standing up and walking toward a thick cluster of dead brush. She drew her hunting knife. Carefully she pushed the brush aside to reveal a thick braided steel cable pulled taut across the gorge, hidden perfectly at the height of a horse's chest. "It's a tripwire, but that's not the real trap." She pointed up to the ridges. Through the heavy sheet of rain, the faint silhouettes of massive boulders could be seen, perched precariously on the edges, held back by wooden wedges. "They wait for the vanguard to hit the wire." Rowan explained, her voice entirely flat. "The horses go down, the column bottles up in the panic, then they knock the wedges out. The rockfall crushes the front half of the army, blocking the gorge and trapping the rest of you in a kill box for crossbow fire." Miller went completely silent. He looked at the tripwire, then up at the rocks. He swallowed hard. Gideon sat on his massive black horse, looking down at Rowan. Rain dripped from his jaw. He didn't look surprised. He looked utterly vindicated. He turned his head slowly to look at his general. "Stores, send 20 men up the eastern ridge on foot." Gideon commanded, his voice slicing through the sound of the rain. "Slit the throats of whoever is holding those wedges. Clear the wire. We move in an hour." As the soldiers scrambled to execute the orders, Gideon dismounted. He walked over to Rowan, his heavy boots splashing in the puddles. He stopped beside her, looking up at the deadly trap she had just dismantled with a glance. "You saved me 100 good men today." Gideon said quietly. I told you I'd earn my keep, Rowan replied, sheathing her knife. You did that weeks ago. Gideon reached out. His large, gauntleted hand grasped her shoulder. The weight of it was grounding. Are you ready to see him? Rowan looked south toward the invisible stronghold of the crag. Her stomach was a tight knot of cold dread and hot, simmering rage. She thought of the day Kaelin threw her onto the cold stone floor. She thought of the way the pack had watched her bleed. I'm ready to watch him fall, she said. Gideon's lips curved into a sharp, terrifying smile. Then let us go break his gates. The fortress of the crag sat atop a jagged outcropping of black stone. It was heavily fortified, ringed by a deep trench and towering wooden palisades. When Gideon's army broke the tree line just before dusk, the warning bells of the keep began to ring frantically. The sound was high and panicked, echoing across the valley. Gideon didn't bother with a siege camp. He didn't order his men to build trebuchets or battering rams. He drew his army up into a massive, terrifying line across the valley floor, completely cutting off any route of escape. Then he rode to the front. Rowan rode beside him. The heavy iron gates of the crag groaned open just a fraction. A small envoy rode out under a white flag of parley. Kaelin was at the centre, flanked by his second-in-command, Cedric, and 3 heavily armed guards. Kaelin looked different. The arrogant strut was gone. He looked exhausted, his eyes darting nervously over the sheer size of Gideon's host. When his gaze landed on Rowan, riding at the right hand of the High King, his face twisted in a complex knot of confusion, anger, and stark realization. The 2 parties stopped 10 yards apart in the mud. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle. King Gideon! Kaelin shouted, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it deeper. This is a violation of the Southern Accords. You march an army onto my land without provocation. You blockaded the king's roads, Gideon replied. His voice didn't carry the frantic volume of Kaelin's. It was a low, resonant boom that carried easily in the damp air. You starved 2 of my border villages. You whispered treason to the southern packs. Do not speak to me of provocation, little Alpha. I did what was necessary to protect my borders from a compromised crown. Kaelin spat, gesturing wildly toward Rowan. You bring a disgraced rogue to my doorstep, a female who couldn't even defend her own territory. You prove my point for me. The North is weak. Rowan didn't flinch. She sat tall in her saddle. She felt Gideon shift slightly beside her, the lethal intent radiating from him like heat from a forge. She is my lead tracker, Gideon stated softly, dangerously. She found your pathetic ambush in the gorge. She navigated the scree fields that your own men refused to walk. She is worth 10 of you. Kaelin sneered, drawing his broadsword. The sound of steel rasping against a leather scabbard was loud in the quiet valley. I am Alpha of the crag. I challenge you, Gideon. 1-on-1, the old way. Alpha to Alpha for the right to rule this territory. It was a desperate, suicidal move. Kaelin knew his army would be slaughtered in a pitched battle. A duel was his only microscopic chance at survival. Gideon looked at Kaelin's drawn sword. Then he unbuckled his heavy black cloak and let it slide from his shoulders into the mud. He dismounted. Hold my horse, Gideon said to Rowan. Rowan took the reins. Don't play with him, she murmured. He fights dirty. Gideon's golden eyes flicked to hers. I don't play. Gideon walked forward, his heavy boots sinking into the muck. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply rolled his broad shoulders. Kaelin roared a desperate, adrenaline-fueled sound and charged. He swung his heavy broadsword in a massive, sweeping arc, aimed directly at Gideon's neck. Gideon didn't draw steel. He stepped inside the arc. The speed of the massive king was incomprehensible. Before Kaelin's blade could connect, Gideon's gauntleted hand shot out, catching Kaelin's wrist. The sound of bones snapping was like a dry branch breaking in a quiet forest. Kaelin screamed, dropping the sword. Gideon didn't hesitate. He drove his armored knee directly into Kaelin's chest. The Alpha's breastplate crumpled inward with a sickening metallic crunch. Kaelin flew backward, landing hard in the mud, gasping for air that his shattered ribs would no longer hold. Cedric Kylan's second-in-command panicked. Seeing his Alpha fall in seconds, he drew a hidden crossbow from beneath his cloak, a coward's weapon for a parley, and leveled it directly at Gideon's exposed back. "Gideon!" Rowan shouted. She didn't wait. In one fluid motion, she drew the heavy throwing axe from her saddle horn and hurled it. The weapon spun end over end, a blur of wood and steel. It buried itself deeply into Cedric's shoulder just as his finger pulled the trigger. The crossbow jerked upward, the heavy bolt firing harmlessly into the sky. Cedric toppled from his horse, screaming, clawing at the axe. Gideon turned slowly. He looked at Cedric bleeding in the mud, then up at Rowan. The feral, chaotic violence in the air suddenly felt intensely focused. Gideon walked over to where Kaelin lay wheezing in the mud. He grabbed the Alpha by the collar of his ruined armor and hauled him up to his knees. "You called her weak." Gideon said, his voice a terrifying whisper that carried to every wolf present. "You threw her out because she had mercy. Look at her now." Kaelin, coughing blood, forced his eyes up to Rowan. She looked down at him from the back of her horse, her face an unreadable mask of cold indifference. She didn't look angry. She looked right through him. He was nothing to her. "I, Gideon of the Northern Wastes, sever your claim," the king declared using the exact ancient words Kaelin had used on Rowan a year prior. "You are no longer Alpha. You are no longer of this land. If you survive your wounds, you will walk into the Scablands as a rogue. If I see your face again, I will mount it on my wall." Gideon dropped him. Kaelin collapsed, a broken, ruined thing. The king turned his gaze to the crag's heavily armed guards and the hundreds of terrified wolves watching from the palisades. "Open the gates!" Gideon roared his command, echoing like thunder, "or I will burn them down with you inside." The heavy wooden doors of the crag swung open without a fight. The heavy iron-studded doors of the great hall groaned in protest as Gideon's vanguard shoved them open. The sound echoed into the high, vaulted ceilings, bouncing off the damp stone walls. Rowan stepped over the threshold. Her boots left thick, dark clumps of mud on the pristine floorboards. The air inside was stagnant. It smelled of roasted venison, wet wool, and the sharp, sour tang of collective terror. But underneath it all, buried in the very marrow of the room, Rowan could still smell the ghost of her own blood. This was the room where Kaelin had stripped her of her pack. This was the exact floor where she had collapsed, gasping through the tearing pain of a severed mating bond, while 40 people watched in absolute silence. Tonight the silence was back. But the audience had changed. The 40 wolves of the crag pack were kneeling. They lined the perimeter of the vast hall, pressed back against the tapestries, as if trying to merge with the stone. Their heads were bowed low, their necks bared in the ultimate desperate display of physical submission. These were the hunters she had tracked beside. These were the elders who had taught her the southern passes. These were the women she had shared hearth fires with. Now they wouldn't even lift their eyes to look at her boots. Gideon's soldiers filed in behind her, a slow, methodical flood of blackened steel and dark leather. They did not speak. They did not gloat. They moved with the terrifying, synchronized discipline of apex predators securing a pen. They took up positions at every door, every window, and behind the kneeling elders. The metallic clatter of their heavy boots was a rhythmic drumbeat of conquest. Rowan walked to the exact center of the room, the spot where she had bled. She stopped. The floor here was clean, the rushes freshly laid, but her mind superimposed the dark puddle of red that had once stained the grout. Her chest tightened. A phantom ache radiated down her left arm. Then a heavy solid weight stopped right beside her. Gideon did not walk to the dais. He did not immediately go to the high seat of black oak that sat empty at the far end of the room. He stayed in the center, right in the kill zone, standing shoulder to shoulder with Rowan. The heat radiating off his massive frame cut through the drafty chill of the hall. He smelled of rain ozone and iron. It was the scent that had become her anchor over the last 4 months. "Look at them." Gideon murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, meant only for her. Rowan turned her head slowly. She scanned the kneeling figures. She saw Maeve huddled near the hearth. The woman was wearing a gown of dyed blue silk, one of the gowns Kaelin had likely purchased with the trade route tolls. The hem was dragged through the mud and soot ruined. Maeve was shaking violently, her hands clamped over her mouth to stifle her sobs. A year ago, Rowan had imagined this moment. In the freezing, miserable depths of her first winter in the Scablands, she had fantasized about burning this hall to the ground. She had wanted them to hurt as she had hurt. But looking at them now, she felt no fiery triumph. She just felt a profound, heavy exhaustion. They weren't monsters. They were just cowards. They had followed Kaelin because he was loud and cruel, and they were kneeling to Gideon because he was stronger. Pack loyalty was a transaction, and the crag was bankrupt. "They're pathetic," Rowan said. The words tasted like ash. "They are leaderless," Gideon corrected softly. "A pack is only as strong as the spine of its alpha. Kaelin had no spine. He had only teeth." Gideon finally moved. He walked slowly toward the dais. Every step was deliberate, his heavy boots striking the stone like a blacksmith's hammer. He climbed the 3 stone steps. He looked at the black oak chair. He reached out, running a gauntleted hand over the carved armrest, tracing the jagged stag sigil of the crag. Then he turned around and remained standing. He refused to sit in a lesser man's chair. "Your alpha is broken!" Gideon's voice boomed. He didn't shout. The sheer resonance of his chest carried the words, effortlessly pressing them into the ears of every trembling wolf in the room. He broke the king's peace. He strangled the trade roads to feed his own vanity, and he starved the innocent to stroke his pride. He is exiled to the very scrub lands he weaponized. A few of the elders flinched, but nobody made a sound. The crag is no longer a sovereign territory. Gideon continued his tone, brutally bureaucratic, devoid of any mercy. "You are a vassal state of Ethelgard. You have proven you cannot govern yourselves. General Miller will remain behind with a garrison of 50 men. You will surrender 1/3 of your winter grain stores as reparation for the villages you starved. You will send your 20 strongest fighters to the north to drill in my vanguard. If you resist, you will be executed. If you hide stores, you will be executed. If you whisper Kaelin's name in the dark, my men will cut out your tongues. Nod if you understand." A ripple of frantic, jerky nods moved through the kneeling crowd. Gideon's golden eyes swept over them with heavy contempt. He had secured the territory. He had broken the rebellion before it could spark. The king had done his duty. Now the man took over. Gideon descended the stone steps. He walked past his generals. He walked past the terrified elders. He walked straight back to the center of the room, stopping directly in front of Rowan. The political, terrifying aura that had filled the room vanished, pulled back into him like a drawn breath. The brutal warlord dissolved, leaving only the man who had sat on an overturned bucket in a filthy kennel and watched her stitch up a wounded dog. "You threw an axe," Gideon said quietly. The corner of his scarred mouth twitched upward in the barest hint of a smile. Rowan swallowed hard. Her pulse, which had been steady throughout the entire siege, suddenly spiked. "He had a crossbow leveled at your spine. I am wearing thick steel, Rowan. Silver bolts punch through steel." She shot back, her voice tight. "I wasn't going to stand there and watch you take another one." Gideon lifted a hand. The massive steel-plated gauntlet looked lethal, designed for crushing windpipes, but his touch was painfully gentle as his knuckles brushed against her jaw. He caught a stray, mud-caked lock of her hair and tucked it behind her ear. "You watched my back." Gideon said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a profound, heavy acknowledgement of debt. You brought a broken starving pack to my doorstep. You cleared my path through the mud. You dismantled their traps. You told me you would earn your keep. I did! She whispered, her throat tight. She hated how vulnerable she sounded, but standing here in the graveyard of her past, the walls she had spent a year building were suddenly crumbling. She didn't need them anymore. The man standing in front of her was the wall. Gideon turned his head. The hard golden stare locked onto the kneeling crowd. "Rise," he commanded. There was a frantic scrambling of limbs as 40 wolves stumbled to their feet. They kept their heads lowered, their shoulders hunched. Gideon reached out and grasped Rowan's hand. He didn't just hold it. He laced his fingers through hers, pulling her slightly forward, forcing her to stand fully in the light of the iron chandeliers. "Look at her," Gideon ordered. The king's voice was back, lethal, commanding, brooking absolutely no disobedience. Slowly, painfully, 40 pairs of eyes dragged themselves upward. Rowan felt the weight of their stares. She braced herself for the shame, for the old suffocating feeling of being judged. But as she looked back at them, she realized there was nothing to fear. They weren't judging her. They were terrified of her. A year ago you stood in this hall and watched a coward throw this woman to the wolves, Gideon said. His voice was a slow, grinding blade. You let him declare her weak because she showed mercy to a starving mother. You let him convince you that brutality was strength. Look where that lie brought you. Look at the ruin of your home. Gideon squeezed her hand. His grip was rough and grounding. She did not break. Gideon continued, his eyes burning into the elders who had turned their backs on her. She survived your exile. She healed my wounds when your Alpha would have let me die in the snow. She returned today, not hiding behind my army, but leading it. She possesses more iron in her blood than the entirety of your pathetic lineage. He turned away from the pack, dismissing them entirely. They were irrelevant. They were just ghosts he had forced to witness her resurrection. He looked down at Rowan. The intensity in his golden eyes stripped the breath right out of her lungs. I do not take a mate to satisfy the political demands of my council. Gideon said, his voice dropping to that intimate, gravelly vibration that resonated deep in her ribs. I do not want a Luna who sits in a high chair and smiles while men bleed for her. I want a partner who knows how to hold a knife in the dark. I want the woman who pulled silver from my flesh. Rowan's heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against her sternum. The cynical, guarded part of her brain screamed at her to step back, to run back to the woods, where it was safe, where she only had to rely on herself. But she looked at the jagged scar running down his face. She looked at the missing tip of his finger. He wasn't a fairy tale prince offering rescue. He was a survivor, scarred and blooded by the same brutal world that had chewed her up. He wasn't offering to save her. He was offering to stand beside her. I don't know how to be soft. Rowan whispered the words, tearing out of her. It was her final, desperate defense. Kaelin cast me out because I wasn't iron, but the Scablands burned everything soft out of me. I am entirely rough edges, Gideon. Good. Gideon replied instantly, his voice a low, feral hum. Soft things die in the north. I do not want you soft, Rowan. I want you exactly as you are. Be my equal. Be my terror. Rule with me. He brought his free hand up his rough, calloused palm, cupping the back of her neck. His thumb pressed against her pulse point. The mating bond didn't snap into place like the violent, artificial tether Kaelin had forced on her. It wasn't magic. It was biological, psychological, and absolute. It was a heavy, warm rush of pure adrenaline and deep, unshakable certainty. It was the feeling of a heavy iron bolt sliding home in a lock. It was the sudden, undeniable knowledge that she was home, and her home was not a place, but the massive, scarred warlord standing in front of her. Rowan looked up into his golden eyes. She let out a long, shaky breath, releasing a year's worth of tension and solitary survival. Okay, she breathed. A small, genuine, and deeply dangerous smile curved her lips. Let's rule. Gideon didn't hesitate. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a polite, courtly kiss. It was a violent, possessive collision of heat and breath. It was a claim staked in front of the very people who had tried to destroy her. Gideon's arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against his heavy steel armor, anchoring her entirely to him. Rowan kissed him back with all the feral, pent-up energy of a year spent alone in the dark, her hands fisting in the fabric of his dark tunic beneath his breastplate. The great hall remained dead silent. The soldiers of Ethelgard stood like statues of black iron, and the wolves of the Krag knelt in the rushes, bearing witness as the outcast they threw away was crowned the most powerful queen in the northern wastes. From the mud of the Scablands to the black oak throne, Rowan proved that true. Alpha strength isn't about cruelty. It's about who you become when the world tries to break you. Kaelin learned the hard way that throwing away a diamond just leaves you holding dirt. If you loved watching Gideon and Rowan dismantle their enemies and claim their crown, smash that like button and share this story with someone who loves a badass, deeply grounded romance. Don't forget to subscribe for more intense, gritty werewolf dramas. Let me know in the comments, what was your favorite moment of Gideon's revenge?